In terms of recent events, it's really important to pay attention to Egypt because essentially Egypt is a bellwether for the rest of the Middle East and North Africa region. Egypt was one of the first countries to experience a revolution, and what we're seeing now in terms of the political divide between Islamists and secularists that is playing out in Egypt is also playing out amongst a lot of other Middle Eastern countries too. So if we can understand what's happening in Egypt, that will also help us to understand future developments in the rest of the region. The first key indicator for change in Egypt will be participation in the constitutional referendum, which is due to happen in November of this year. At the moment, it's looking likely that that process will be boycotted by the Muslim Brotherhood. What we don't know is the extent to which other Islamist parties are going to boycott that process as well. For example, the Al-Nour party or the Jama'a Islamiyya group. At present, those groups still look as though they would like to take part in the constitutional redrafting process, although their influence over that has been very much reduced. They've threatened on a number of occasions to withdraw from that process. If they were to do so and to join forces with the Muslim Brotherhood, that would raise the risks of destabilizing unrest around the time of the referendum in November. The second indicator for change in Egypt is whether the newly elected Egyptian government that will come into power early next year will accept the conditions laid down by the International Monetary Fund to supply it with a loan. Now, Egypt spends about $1.7 billion each month on food and fuel imports. And until now, it's been able to sustain itself largely by injections of money through allied Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia. However, this situation is unsustainable. Egypt really needs to get access to IMF funding in order to really make any difference to its economic situation, which right now is very poor. What's important to most Egyptians is having food on the table and having access to fuel. Now, under former President Morsi, that was a problem. Since the army took over, we've seen these injections of Gulf aid improve the situation, but they're really going to need IMF funding going forward to keep that situation improving. And for that purpose, they're probably going to have to make subsidy cuts in order to meet the terms of the IMF conditions. That in turn raises protest risks in itself. The cut of subsidies in Egypt is likely to be very controversial and likely to see mass protests, even among people who are not particularly politicized and don't support either the Muslim Brotherhood or the army one particular way or the other. So if the new government agrees to make those cuts, that will be positive in the long term for funding, but in the short term there's a very high risk of protests. The third key indicator for change in Egypt would be whether Islamist militias are able to form and are able to take over several villages and towns simultaneously. Now, what we see at the moment is that most of the militant capability in Egypt is concentrated in the Sinai Peninsula, and in that area we know that there's a large quantity of smuggled weapons and explosives going through there, for example, rocket-propelled grenades, and other weapons that come between Libya and the Gaza Strip and are smuggled through that area. So far, militants in the rest of Egypt have not really obtained that capability yet. However, if we were to see them start to obtain that capability, to transfer it into the rest of Egypt, and to obtain large weapons caches which could be used in the rest of Egypt, that would strengthen their capability to move on from the current sporadic terrorist attacks, for example, the 5th of September attempted assassination of the Interior Minister in Cairo with a bomb, move on from that type of incident towards a more sustained campaign to actually take over towns and villages, and that would be much more threatening to the army and show that the army was losing control of the situation. One key indicator for change will be whether the current Defence Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's also an army general, decides to stand for president in the elections that are scheduled to be held in early 2014. Now, right now, the army is very popular amongst the Egyptian public, and especially al-Sisi, who's viewed as the man who stood up to the Muslim Brotherhood and rescued the Egyptian public from the chaotic situation that existed under former President Morsi. And there are a lot of people calling for Sisi to stand as president. However, The army until now has been content to exert its political influence from behind the scenes, and really that is safer for it, to have a civilian figurehead president who can take the blame for any economic or political problems that might emerge, and who can be changed easily without disturbing the army's own economic and political interests, which would remain safe. So it's really up to al-Sisi whether he decides to run for president. But we would see this as quite a high-risk strategy, because the risk would be for Sisi that any economic problems or any political problems will instead be blamed on him and on the rest of the army. And if protests start to really target the army and call for the army to withdraw from politics, that would be a very risky situation for the army.